Yeah, my name is Pasi. I'm working, still currently working. I'm a director of Patmos Foundation, which is a Finnish missions and relief organization. And kind of my personal interest for over 30 years has been in apologetics. But I am not a scholar. So I am not bringing to you some kind of recent discoveries or my own scholarly findings. But I am, like someone said, I let the other people do the heavy lifting. And then I try to shift out from there relevant material that I could share with other people, which probably would be helpful to you when you meet people and you try to convince them about the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus. And what I would like to do today in this our workshop is that when I'm presenting these 5 points, I would like us to do as much possible discussion so that you can also weigh in with what you know and how you would like to expand this topic in these 5 areas. Maybe we find the 6th or 7th point that apologists should know how to answer, because there is nothing magical about the number 5, of course, except perhaps I should think the 5 sling stones that we heard today, this morning, in the morning plenary. But I have chosen these 5 topics because I have come across with these questions when I deal with people in our radio programs. I've been doing radio broadcasting for about 30 years. That's one main part of my ministry. And we have one live-in call-in program where people can call and ask all kinds of questions about Christianity, about faith, Christian ethics, and things like that. So I come across with these questions. And hopefully today we're going to find out something very useful that you can also use and kind of make our thoughts, activate our thoughts for the cause of Christ. So, without further ado, let's unveil those 5 secrets that are still here. The first question, which is rather, I would say, kind of silly probably, because no one today would seriously argue that Jesus did not exist. But I think it's good for us also as apologists to be ready to tackle with this question to some level. Because there are few names who are trying to kind of rehash these old arguments about non-existence of Jesus, that he never actually existed. He was just some kind of a figure, a literature figure or something like that. So I want to give you a few pointers and a few ideas of what one should know about this issue. And number 1 is, of course, that not very many scholarly-minded people take this question seriously today. I think it was a man called Wells who espoused this idea, and also, let me say, there's a second one whose name just escaped my mind, who are quite strongly trying to advocate today the idea that Jesus was just some kind of invention. But I would refer to you, for example, to this book, Gary Habermas. Who knows Gary's name? Okay, that was my test of checking you out. Gary Habermas, who is a scholar from the United States, especially, he has studied the resurrection of Jesus. He has written this fantastic book, The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ. And he enumerates altogether 45 ancient sources with 129 reported facts concerning the life, person, teaching, death and resurrection of Jesus, plus disciples' earliest message, which are sources outside New Testament. Because usually when people challenge you about the existence of Jesus, they say, what other proofs do you have besides the New Testament? And Gary Habermas has done a wonderful job in kind of listing out sources outside the New Testament. And I think one of his most interesting thesis is that actually embedded within the New Testament text, we have sources that predate New Testament, namely several creeds which are older than our existing New Testament text, but they found their way to the New Testament. Now, just to give one example, which is actually very well known, let me take 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul writes about the resurrection of Jesus. He writes like this: "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep." So when he's listing 4 separate points about Jesus here, and he's doing it in such a way that scholars have come to the conclusion that Paul is actually quoting a tradition which is earlier than him. So it means it is earlier than 1 Corinthians. It is earlier than when Paul wrote the 1 Corinthians. And this creedal material, including that Christ died for our sins, according to Scriptures, that he was buried, so his death and his burial is attested here, that he was raised on the third day, according to Scriptures, and then his appearance to the various disciples as historical facts. So Paul is actually quoting material that he received, which are older than our New Testament. So that's one of the interesting points that Habermas makes there, and he of course shows the reader several of these kind of hymns and creedal forms that you can find in the New Testament. Then of course we have archaeological proofs, which are not, of course, direct proofs, because we can't find any inscription that Jesus was here or something like that. But we have a plenty of archaeological material that kind of, in a circumstantial way, point to the reality and the truthfulness of the Gospels. One of those would be the heel bone of the crucified man from the 1st century that you can actually see if you go to the museum in Jerusalem. There is this pierce. There is the nail which is still going through the heel bone, and it belonged to I think it was a guy named Johanan, which kind of testifies to the fact of the crucifixion in the 1st century. Habermas doesn't mention, I don't know why, maybe because the book was a bit older, for example, the finding of the ossuary, the bone box of high priest Caiaphas, which was found in the 90s in Jerusalem, which proves, of course, that this figure who was part of the trial of Jesus was a real historical figure. Then he lists non-Christian sources, and I don't want to go into all these quotations that you can readily find if you just Google Josephus and Tacitus and Herodotus. But of course, there are several mentions both in the Jewish early sources, the few that I mentioned, the Roman sources, which are, of course, various. Their value is very, very different, of course. And then there are some Christian sources outside New Testament, and he refers to the early church fathers who, again, testify to certain facts of the life of Jesus. And of course, someone might say, which is true, that many of the early church fathers, they were dependent on the Gospels, but yet they kind of give corroboration to the New Testament story about Jesus. And then here is, I think, a book that I want to recommend to you, a very scholarly book by Robert van Voorst, Jesus Outside the New Testament, where he goes very scholarly through all these various ancient sources that speak about Jesus and evaluates them, what is their historical value. Going through the Roman sources that I just mentioned, Thucydides, Herodotus, then Jewish, Josephus, what does Talmud say about Jesus? Early Christian sources, going then towards the Gnostic and heretic texts and apocryphal Gospels, and he evaluates the information that we can get from them about Jesus. And of course, they are of various values. But he makes this interesting point. Whether you think about all the scholarly dispute that there exists about Josephus or even the Talmudic material, there is this Toledo Jesu literature, which was kind of polemics against the Christian faith, and you can get certain glimpses about Jesus there. He makes this interesting point that nobody in those early centuries came up with the accusation or an argument that Jesus that Christians speak about never existed. And I think that's a very interesting point, because they could have very well made, if the story of Jesus was invented or that Jesus never existed, why nobody in those early centuries came up with this explanation? But they always took the early sources seriously enough to fight against them or write polemics against Christians and their beliefs. Celsus, who was writing against Origen, is accusing Christians to be very, or Jesus was just some kind of a sorcerer or misleading people. Also in Talmud, Jesus is seen as some kind of a magician who learned his ancient arts, and he was misleading people. But they never came up with the explanation that Jesus was not a real historical person, which I think is a detail worth remembering. Then these three books here to remind me of the three important ideas. Richard Burridge has written What Are the Gospels?, which is really a groundbreaking research about the genre of the New Testament and genre of the Gospels particularly. And to make a long story short, there was a scholarly discussion about the genre of Gospels in the early 20th century and in the mid-20th century that said that we don't know what the Gospels are actually. We don't know. Their genre is kind of sui generis, some kind of a special kind of genre. We don't know what it is. But the most definitely they are not biographies. That was what the critical scholars used to say. Now, Richard Burridge has certainly turned the tide in this area of scholarship, because he has carefully detailed from the old sources from antiquity that the Gospels follow the genre of the biographical genre of writing. Namely, that they were actually the writers wanted to write about the life of the person as a real biography. In certain edges of this gospel genre, it may go towards the historical writings, like in the Gospel of Luke is probably somewhere between the history and the biography. But they definitely wanted to write about the life of Jesus. So if you want to write about the life of a person who lived, what kind of literary device would you choose? Well, biography would be an obvious possibility, isn't it? So I recommend that if you ever get it to your reading list. So what we can say today is that when we think about Jesus and him as a real person, is that Gospels are biographies of Jesus. They write about real living person. Bauckham has made an excellent case about Gospels being the eyewitness testimony about Jesus. And then there is this third one, which let me show you one video, because Lydia McGrew has made a very interesting case about what she calls undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, which underlie the fact that Gospels are made of material that reflect eyewitness testimony. These undesigned coincidences are kind of, let's say that one Gospel mentions something very incidentally, just like in passing. And another Gospel refers to that same thing, but also clearly in such a way that the writer is not copying the other writer, namely independently. For example, in the Gospel of John, we read that Jesus is at the wedding feast at Canaan, and there are 6 jars of water according to the Jewish purification customs. Now, John doesn't go into details what does that actually mean. But the Gospel of Mark mentions something interesting about the Pharisees and scribes, completely independently about John. He mentions that the Pharisees don't sit at the table or do anything until they have very carefully washed themselves after they come, clean themselves in ritually. So clearly those empty jars of water there at the Feast of Canaan, they were empty because they had already ritually purified themselves, these Jews. Okay, I'm not going to go into these details, but you all know probably about the textual integrity of the New Testament. So that if in very brief you should respond to someone who says that, well, I don't even know if Jesus existed, then you can of course refer them to your local theological faculty, probably to ask the most critical scholar that you can find there. And they will probably defend the historicity of Jesus to them, because no one seriously doubts that Jesus ever existed. And we have very, very well attested New Testament manuscripts, which brings us to the generation of eyewitnesses. Now this is the second one, unless you have any questions or comments on the first one. Sorry. Okay, we can continue. Was the story of Jesus borrowed from pagan myths? There was a time somewhere in the 60s when in theology there was the school of history of religion school, when the critical scholars tended to explain everything in the New Testament or everything in the Christian faith as having been borrowed from mystery religions or from other outside sources. And this thought kind of made a popular comeback after it was totally discredited in the academia, actually. But it made a popular comeback by a movie called Zeitgeist. I don't know if you've heard. Okay, Zeitgeist. Oh my. The amount of email that I received after the Zeitgeist was woof. So basically, the claim is that the story of Christianity and the story of Jesus is kind of a copy from the ancient myths, such as Egyptian Horus or Indian story of Krishna, Greeks, Attis, Persians, Mithra. Greece had their Dionysus, and of course Christians have Jesus. So for example, Krishna is claimed to have been born of a virgin, and when he was born, a star was seen in the east. They claim that he performed miracles, and he was resurrected. That's what they say. And all these same kind of details, supposedly, you can find from these various sources. So now here is that thesis, very bluntly. The nucleus of the popular cults, as the cult of Attis, Osiris, and Adonis, is this. A divine being comes to earth, assumes human form, dies a violent death, rises, and through union with him, men are redeemed. And what does Paul teach? A being that existed in the form of God appeared on earth in the likeness of sinful flesh, was crucified and rose from the dead. Men, through their relation to this experience of a celestial being, are redeemed. This was what George Holley Gilbert said. He was an American scholar in the 1920s. So that kind of encapsulates this thesis. And this is it seems it's very popular in the internet. And all these kind of internet skeptics, at least when they are having their morning coffees, they like to write these kind of things to you and challenge you. But here is, again, a very, very good resource for that. And I have kind of summarized certain critical points that clearly show that this thesis doesn't work. Ronald Nash, in his book, The Gospel and the Greeks, make these following points about this thesis that Jesus is just copied from the mystery religions. First of all, one has to take into consideration the uncompromising monotheism and the exclusiveness of the early church. They were as intolerant towards pagan mythologies and foreign gods as were the ancient Hebrew prophets. He also makes this interesting point that, of course, the Hellenistic world was very syncretistic. They took influences from here and there. And later maybe Gnosticism was a kind of form of thinking that kind of took a little bit of Christianity and a little bit of some other thoughts from the Hellenistic thought. But the early church was very opposed very strongly this kind of syncretism. But this Hellenistic syncretism, according to Nash, was God's providential preparation of the world for the gospel. So God knew when to send Jesus and when the gospel came into this world. So people were very open, at least more open than in earlier times. But it did not affect the monotheism and the exclusiveness of the early Christianity. He also makes the point that one has to notice that every critic who raises this issue about mystery religions works from certain presuppositions. And basically these presuppositions are anti-supernaturalistic. Now, if you can't believe in miracles, or if you are convinced that miracles can't happen, then of course you have to find some other explanation to the New Testament testimony, isn't it? Jesus, who turned water into wine, walked on the waters, died and rose from the dead, just simply doesn't fit into a very naturalistic narrative, isn't it? So you will have to try to find an explanation of why the gospel stories are the way they are. So there are presuppositions in the minds of critics and also in the minds of internet skeptics. And one has to notice that the big problem with all these claims about Jesus being a copied from mystery religions or ancient myths is this, that many times these claims that I just showed you in that one mosaic there, it's a kind of a composite image where you take one feature from one story, another feature from another story. And in the end, you may have 5, 6, or 7 features, and you lump them together, and lo and behold, you can find them all in the story of Jesus. And now you claim that, look, the story of Jesus just kind of put all these things together. But they are based on oversimplifications, exaggeration, and sometimes outright invention. And they are based on secondary, not primary sources. Now, if you go and read the stories yourself, for example, I remember I went through the stories of Krishna. There are basically 2 sources about the life of Krishna. I am sorry, I don't know how to pronounce those Indian sources, but there are 2 of them. And Dr. Edwin Bryant, who is the professor of Hinduism in one of the universities, says that these sources are variously, or let's say that these sources are very late. They are from somewhere from the 4th or 5th century, and most likely from the 11th century after Christ. So you have the problem of the timing of these sources. And he also says that if anybody got any influence, then it is definitely not that the story of Krishna influenced Christianity. It's the gospel that was spreading all over the world that influenced the stories of Hinduism, which eventually found their way into the sources that tell about Krishna. So when you hear about these fantastic claims that Attis or Horus or some other ancient figure has the same features as Jesus, then you always have to ask, where are the sources? And usually they are very late. Very late sources, the direction of influence is usually the other way around, most likely. And then also, Nash makes this observation that the development of mystery religions did not happen until 2nd century after Christ, and the Christianity encountered these mystery religions sometime in the 3rd century. So Paul most likely was not affected by these mystery religions. So you have to try to find a different answer to the birth of Christianity. And then, of course, the differences matter, because when you look closely to these stories, you find that they don't actually speak about resurrection, for example. If Krishna kind of, at the end of his life, hovers somewhere up in the air, that's not a resurrection. Resurrection was when a person died, he was buried, and then he rose back to life. But this never happens in any of these mythical stories of Attis and Horus and things like that. So the differences are very important. The third question that definitely every Christian should know how to answer, at least on some level: was Jesus really risen from the dead? And of course, I don't mean that, yes, I know he rose from the dead because he lives in my heart, which is, of course, the testimony of the Holy Spirit. And I'm not at all trying to discredit that. But when a person asks this question, they usually want to know that what evidences do you have that he is really risen from the dead. And when an unbeliever asks you about how can we know that Jesus rose from the dead, I sometimes take the person first to our world and I ask them to think about the situation like this, that imagine that someone, your close friend whom you've known for years, has just recently died violent death, and you are at his funeral. And they bring the casket, and you want that they open the casket, or is the coffin, you call it, one more time. And they open it, and it's empty. So the question immediately comes to your mind: what happened to his body? So did the pastor or the parish, did they mess up somehow the casket? Was it the wrong casket, isn't it? Or did somebody remove the body? What happened to the body? There's a confusion. And then someone comes to the parish where you are with the people trying to solve this mystery, and says that, look, I was just sitting with this person. We drank coffee. We talked about his life. We thought he was dead, but now he is alive. And you start thinking, well, that is very strange indeed, isn't it? But then if more people, and finally even yourself, you meet that person who died violent death, you may be ready to believe that actually he is raised from the dead. He's come back to life. And then you remember, oh yes, but didn't he say that something like this would happen a few days after he's gone? So that is the kind of the psychological world of the disciples when they meet these three things, or two things. Empty tomb. It is a historical fact that the tomb was found empty 3 days and 3 nights after Jesus had been crucified. Secondly, that he appeared, or his disciples, in various places, independently from one another. They had experiences where they saw Jesus. They believed that they actually saw this man alive. Now you have to explain these two facts, and you have to explain the third fact, which is that how come the disciples started to believe that the man who was previously dead is now alive? This is simply a historical question that demands an answer. N.T. Wright makes an interesting point in his massive volume about the resurrection. He says that whereas the idea of resurrection was rather peripheral in the Jewish thinking, there the resurrection, when it happens somewhere in the end of the world, and everyone are raised together. But in Christianity, the resurrection moves to the center of whole belief system. There would be no Christianity without belief in the resurrection, and particularly a resurrection of one particular person, namely Jesus, who was eschatologically raised from the dead on the third day. What accounts for this change in the Jewish thinking, which still is very typically Jewish way of thinking about resurrection? So you need to explain the origin of disciples' belief that Jesus rose from the dead. And how is that explained best, if not with the empty tomb and postmortem appearances, which prove that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And that's why they came to believe that he is alive. And then the classic, faith versus science. Now here I think I would like to open more floor for discussion, because this is a one question. I have one more. One question that always comes up. Hasn't science proved there is no God? And I think usually people think about the debate between evolution versus creation. So that when the science supposedly has now discovered the mechanism that explains that we don't need God. So doesn't that prove that God doesn't exist? And of course, the intelligent design movement has come up with first of all, challenging the simple Darwinian mechanism of random mutations and natural selection, showing that is not a viable solution of how organisms evolve. So the question about design is back on the table. Then the famous God of the gaps versus science of the gaps, namely that Christianity, this is more like a claim only that the more science advances, the area of faith gets smaller and smaller. Kind of science drives God out of these gaps of ignorance. But of course, then we notice that also science has certain gaps, and people have certain faith, a childlike faith in the almost unlimited possibilities of science to explain everything. And in those areas where science does not explain something, or where other explanations are more viable, we can always just have faith, kind of eschatological expectation that one day science will explain everything. But then we have the problem, what I call the problem of the mind. Of course, philosophers call it the problem of the mind, namely that although I can be certain about my own thoughts and my own mind, I cannot be completely scientifically certain about your minds. But I just have to believe that you are similar persons with the same kind of rational minds that I am. Because you can't prove scientifically other minds. I am just aware of my own thinking. And it challenges the materialism also in other ways, because thoughts are not material. Now, if you think, for example, what could you think? You could think about your dream house right now. Think about it. Just imagine it in your mind. How many floors and things like that. Now, if we would open your head, where would that house be? It most definitely is not in your head. It's not in your brains. No one else would see it, because thoughts are not material things. Material objects have weight. They have, their width and depth and all these kind of things. But thoughts are not material things. They exist not in your brains, they exist in your mind. And that is a kind of proof of soul, I would say. How do we know what we know? Science can't explain everything. People think that science has proved that there is no God, but the problem is that there are things which are beyond capabilities of science to explain. Because there are other ways of knowing things besides just putting them in a test tube. And then the near-death experiences, which is actually, there is a very, very how do you say it in English? I mean, it's bubbling all the time. The research in the near-death experience is really going hot these days. Because more and more people are telling about their experiences of being clinically dead, and yet they have been aware of their surroundings, even when their brain functions have been zero. So you cannot explain them away by referring to some kind of oxygen deficiency in your brain, or some kind of subconscious part of, or some part of your brain producing some kind of hallucinations, when in some instances brains were not functioning at all, and this person was aware of his surroundings or her surroundings very vividly. And one, how I would say, a provocation there is Shroud of Turin. I have a friend who is one of the top anthropologists in Finland, whose specialty is in revealing the documentary and other kinds of forgeries. And he has done extensive study on the Shroud of Turin, the international study on the burial cloth of Jesus. And he says that it is the most studied relic and object in the whole human history. If any other object would have been subject to such a scrutiny as the Shroud of Turin, they would have long ago said that of course it is authentic. But because there is the possibility that it is the burial cloth of Jesus, that's why there are still those diehard people who won't accept it. So I think the situation in the syndonology, I think they call it, is today is not so much that what we used to ask as Christians as what does it mean if it is not the burial cloth of Jesus? What would it mean to our faith? We don't base our faith on the Shroud of Turin. But scientifically, we could ask, what if it is the burial cloth of Jesus? The evidences are quite strong that it is an authentic burial cloth. Whether, if it's not the burial cloth of Jesus, then the question remains, whose burial cloth? But all the details match very well. And this I say without basing my faith on the Shroud of Turin, of course, but I would say that it is something worth knowing about. I think this is a challenge that comes up more and more because of the influence of new atheists. Namely, is God immoral? How do you explain the ethics in the Bible? If God exists, then what kind of God would command genocide of Canaanites? Now, I would immediately challenge the whole term genocide here, but we can come to that. Then there is a claim that you can't draw your ethics from the Bible. The Bible is not applicable in modern times. And then, of course, the challenge goes that what about the ethics in Christian history? What about crusades, witch hunts, slavery, and all these kind of things? Suddenly you start feeling so awful, isn't it, for being a Christian when you get these challenges. Now, if you should answer very quickly on these things, then of course you can first raise up the question that how do we, in general, how can we make any kind of ethical and moral differentiations without God? How do we know what is good or bad? Because you need some kind of anchor point from which you draw your idea of good and bad. Because like Ravi Zacharias put it very nicely, he said that if you say there is something bad, you actually admit that there must be something good, isn't it? Now, if you admit that there is a good and there is bad or evil, then you need a norm with which you make this differentiation. And if you have a norm to make the difference between good and evil, you need a norm giver. But what atheist is trying to do, he's trying to deny that there is no norm giver. Therefore, if there is no norm giver, there is no norm. Therefore, there is no way of telling between good and evil. The whole question about morality becomes irrelevant. And to accuse Bible or accuse God for anything immoral or anything presupposes the existence of God, because you could not even make that accusation if God did not exist. Now, what do you say to a person who brings up the idea, the accusation about genocides of Canaanites? Why? Maybe if we had our friend and brother Paul Copan here, he would give you a fantastic lecture on this idea. His book, Is God a Moral Monster?, is definitely a read in this area. And I think he has really done a great job in showing that at least part of in the Old Testament where he speaks about going into a land of Canaan and killing everybody is a Near Eastern war rhetoric, because later on you still find that there are Canaanites living in the midst of Israelites. But I think the short answer to this would be, at least what I usually offer to people, is that it was not a genocide, it was a divinely mandated death penalty. It was a divine judgment, just in the way as the flood was, or when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, of course, it included everybody. The command of God, the judgment of God included everybody, just like in the flood or in the Sodom and Gomorrah. And God has right to do that, because we are sinners. And we are so horrified by what happened there in Canaan, because I think we think that they were very progressed nations and their sins were just some kind of, their sins were not so serious. But if we would see even our own sins the way that God sees them, we would accept His judgments, whatever His judgments are. And that's what I would say to this accusation, that actually it was a righteous punishment for those civilizations who had thoroughly corrupted themselves beyond any possibility of redemption anymore. Like, I think it's in the Genesis. I'm sorry, I don't have my Finnish Bible, and I read my Bible in Finnish, but in Genesis, where God appears to Abraham, He says that in the so and so many generations, your descendants will return to this land, because the measure of sin of the Amorites is not yet full. So God was gracious to wait for over 400 years until the sin came to the full measure in those lands. And then He used Israelites as an instrument of His judgment, just like He used Babylon as an instrument of His judgment over Israel when they fell into same sins as the Canaanites did. Ethics in Christian history, what about crusades, witch hunts, slavery? Each of these would deserve a separate lecture, because there are lots of popular myths about these things, like what were the crusades, why were the crusades, and things like that. But in short, we could always say that just because people don't follow the teaching of Jesus doesn't mean that Christianity is not true, isn't it? It's true of us. We don't always follow the teaching of Jesus. We do things which are prohibited in the Bible. That's called sin. And so it goes with the Christian history. Just because you can find a person doing something wrong doesn't mean that Christianity is not true. Just like if you would catch your, let's say your geography teacher for shoplifting, doesn't mean that Earth is not round, isn't it? Ethics from the Bible. How can you draw ethics from the Bible? Again, a very long discussion there. But of course, we have to make there are certain interpretive rules by which we approach the divine text and draw from there what is true, what is right. It's not that we follow everything that the persons in the Bible did, because they also gave us bad examples how not to do things, isn't it? So not everything that they did is for us an example to follow. And that's usually what the critics forget. They just think that just because it's in the Bible, every Christian should do the same. But of course, we don't read the scripture that way.